So welcome to what's a combination of the last integrative biology seminar of the semester and the fourth CCSAW seminar on sentience. And as many of you know, we're at the University of Guelph, which is based on the traditional lands and territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit. And it's my great pleasure today to introduce Dr. Andrew Crump. So Andrew is an animal welfare researcher who's worked on a bunch of kind of normal species like macaques, dogs, cattle and chickens, but then a few years ago branched out and started exploring things with crusty legs and ectoskeletons, because he's become very interested in the possibility of sentience in invertebrates. And so this move came after his PhD at Queen's University Belfast. He then did a postdoc with Jonathan Birch, who's a philosopher at the London School of Economics. And the work they did there, that team did, ended up convincing the UK government that crustacea should be treated as sentient. So Andrew's going to be even more provocative today and raise the possibility that insects are sentient, because it's important, because we use and potentially abuse them on a completely phenomenal scale. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Andrew. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Georgia. Just whilst I try and share, can you see my slideshow here?
Yep.
Fantastic. I will just say, by the way, that when it comes to normal species, since the vast majority of life on Earth in terms of species and individuals are the ones with the crusty legs, I think they're the normal ones, and all the boring kind of fluffy ones are the abnormal ones. But anywho, we'll get to the controversial stuff a bit later. So I'm going to be talking about evidence for sentience in insects. Thank you very much to Georgia for inviting me to do this. As she said, it's a topic I've been working on for a while. But
you muted yourself, Andrew. Can you please turn your mute thing back on and just start the slide over?
There we go. Yes, thank you. Yes, there we go. Sorry about that. Yeah, I was just going to say that this presentation has a kind of big idea. There's an argument behind it here, which I'm going to try and make to you. So I have a kind of a secret agenda, and there we go. That big idea is this. The animal welfare science, the field that I work in, is kind of fundamentally misguided. Now, lest that sound kind of too hubristic, shocker, the white guy thinks everyone else is doing it wrong and he's doing it right. I will say that I'm also, I think, doing this wrong. And so I think it's a real field-wide issue, which I'd like to try and raise. So that's my aim with this presentation. But in the interest of creating a kind of sense of suspense, I'm not going to say why I think animal welfare science is fundamentally misguided until the very end. So there's a good reason for you to stick around. So let's start with the number of mentions of different animals in animal welfare journals. This is a paper that's quite old now, it's from 2014, but it was looking at number of mentions of different groups of animals in the major welfare journals. So you can see that for cows and pigs, you have kind of 160-ish mentions per year. For poultry, it's about half that, about 80 mentions per year. Crustaceans managed a paltry, I think, 7 mentions that year. And insects, which are kind of broadly the topic of my presentation today, although I'll talk about invertebrates more generally as well. Insects weren't even mentioned by this, presumably because they didn't get any mentions in animal welfare journals at all. So animal welfare scientists, I think it's clear to say, and this certainly is still the case, are focusing very much on kind of charismatic mammals, to a lesser extent on birds, and really not very much on invertebrates like insects. But this doesn't really reflect, I think, the number of animals that we actually use as humans. So if we think about how many animals are killed by people worldwide, this is the figure for beef cattle. It's about 300 million annually worldwide, which is quite a lot of animals, but it's not if we compare it to, say, the number of chickens. So about 300 million beef cows slaughtered annually, about 1.5 billion pigs, but then there's kind of whopping like 50 billion chickens. And yet if we think back to the number of mentions of these groups of animals in animal welfare journals, chickens are getting about half as many mentions as cows and pigs are. So I think this is starting to tell us that actually animal welfare scientists are not focusing on where the big welfare issues are, at least in terms of number of individuals. And if that's true for chickens, it's even more true for the invertebrates. So take one group of invertebrates, the crustaceans, for example. A very conservative estimate might say there are, say, 250 billion crustaceans being killed annually by humans. That's not only more than the total number of chickens, it's actually more than the total number of all mammal and bird livestock that we're slaughtering per year. So huge, huge numbers of individual animals. And yet only 7 mentions in animal welfare journals in a year, far fewer than the number of cows and pigs and chickens. So huge numbers of animals being killed by humans, potentially huge welfare risks, and yet very, very little research is being done on these kinds of animals. And so the question, I guess, is, well, why? Why aren't we studying things like crustaceans, which are numerically so much superior to animals like pigs and cows? And when I ask welfare scientists this question, I guess a point that they often raise is, well, does their welfare matter? Should we care about the welfare of, say, a crustacean or an insect? And to illustrate the point that they make here, I like to bring in an example which I call the parable of the pebble and the poodle. It's not really a parable, but the idea is that imagine that I have a big hammer and I go and hit these 2 entities on the top. So I hit the pebble and I hit the poodle. Now, the question really is, should we care ethically about hitting these 2 entities? Maybe you might care about both of them. You might say, okay, you shouldn't hit either the pebble or the poodle with the hammer. Maybe you might care about one but not the other, or maybe you might care about neither. Now, I'm not going to labor this point because I think most people would agree we shouldn't be hitting poodles with hammers. That's wrong in a way that it's not wrong to hit a pebble with a hammer. And so the question, I suppose, becomes, well, why? What is this ethical dividing line between pebble and poodle? Why does the poodle have this kind of category of welfare, but the pebble doesn't? What's that kind of ethical dividing line between these animals, between these entities, sorry? And the answer to that, perhaps not surprisingly, given the name of the seminar series, I think, is that we think that the poodle is sentient. So sentience is the capacity to have subjectively experienced positive or negative mental states, what we might call in everyday language feelings. And we all have these all the time, things like pain and pleasure and hunger and thirst and warmth and depression and excitement, these negatively and positively valence mental states, these feelings. And so we think that probably the poodle does have feelings. If we hit it with a hammer, it feels pain, in a way that the pebble just doesn't. And so I think we can say that, well, sentience matters ethically. This is a very famous quote by the philosopher Jeremy Bentham, and he's trying to answer this question of when should we care about an entity's welfare? And he says the question is not can they reason, nor can they talk, but rather can they suffer? So for Bentham, it's not about intelligence, it's not about verbosity, but instead it's about capacity for suffering. And I think nowadays we might often talk about sentience instead of suffering, because sentience encompasses positive feelings as well as negative ones. So this characteristic of sentience is really important ethically. I think the fact that we think that the poodle is sentient but the pebble isn't is a really major reason for why we think that the poodle has welfare, the poodle deserves our care, in a way that the pebble just doesn't. Sentience also, though, matters legally, and it matters legally because if we're drafting animal welfare law, we need to know where we should draw the line. Which animals should it apply to? Now, an obvious answer to that might be, well, why don't we protect all animals? It's called animal welfare law. The trouble with that is that there are huge numbers of microscopic invertebrate animals, which firstly, if we protected, I think would be unnecessary because I think many of them are not sentient. But also it would be just completely impractical. We couldn't actually, I think, draft an animal welfare law which covered all of these animals because you wouldn't be able to scratch your face or go for a walk or drive a car without causing this massive level of legal issues. And so when drafting animal welfare law, we need to decide where to draw the line, and which animals are sentient has been seen often as a good way of doing that. Also, I think it's become quite fashionable in lots of countries in the last few decades to recognize animals as sentient under law. So actually drafting laws saying we recognize animals or certain animals as sentient beings. So, for example, there was one passed in Quebec, another one in Tanzania. That was actually one of the earliest ones. Tanzania is recognizing animals as sentient. New Zealand, in a revision to their Animal Welfare Act more recently, recognized animals as sentient. The EU's Lisbon Treaty recognises animals as sentient, and then most recently the UK's Animal Welfare Sentience Act of 2022 recognises animals as sentient beings. And this was a piece of legislation that, as Georgia mentioned, my team and I played a very small role in. And so I'm going to use it as sort of an example of addressing this kind of question of which animals are sentient for the purposes of legislation. So when this law was originally a bill, the Animal Welfare Sentience Bill, originally the civil servants who drew it up basically defined animal as any vertebrate other than Homo sapiens. So they said that we shouldn't consider any invertebrates as sentient, only vertebrates. And so the answer to the question of which animals are sentient according to those civil servants was just to say these vertebrate animals and to leave all the rest of the invertebrate life out. But that pretty quickly started raising issues, and the civil service and the government of the time basically wanted to know whether certain groups of invertebrates might possibly be considered sentient and whether they should be included under this legislation as well. I think here's probably a good time to come in and say why studying sentience in animals, why answering this question of which animals are sentient is challenging. We can't simply say, I think scientifically, this group of animals is definitely sentient and that group of animals definitely isn't. Because I think sentience just isn't a phenomenon that's a very easy one for scientists to study. And I think that's because sentience is characterized by being private and subjective. Your sentient experience is very much your own. It's private. Others can't see into your sentient experience. It's very much subjective. I can't feel it for you, although we can have things like empathy. Science, on the other hand, is very good at studying phenomena which are observable and objective, so things you can measure, things you can see. And so there's this kind of friction always when we're studying sentience between the nature of sentience being private and subjective and the things that science is good at studying, these observable, objective phenomena. Now, we humans can get around this by describing our feelings using language. That's imperfect. For example, people might lie about how they're feeling. But broadly speaking, it gives us a way to transmit our feelings. And the problem is that this is obviously impossible for other animals. They can't do this. So how can we understand how other animals are feeling, or indeed whether they're feeling anything at all? A classic example of this kind of problem and the challenge of studying sentience is this distinction between what's known as nociception and pain. So nociception, I guess, is a kind of broad term talking about the processing of noxious stimuli, stimuli that cause actual potential tissue damage. Whereas pain is the unpleasant feeling associated with nociception. So pain is the sentient experience. But the two, crucially, are not the same thing. So nociceptive reflexes do not require pain. What this means is that if we're looking at an animal and we see that it avoids or withdraws from a noxious stimulus, that doesn't necessarily tell us that it feels pain. Here's an example of why that is in the human case. So this is a simplified diagram of a person touching a needle, so getting their finger pricked by a needle. And there are essentially two processes that happen here, which we can sort of semi-separate out. The first is happening in this red circle here. So that's a nerve impulse traveling from the finger, which is pricked, up to the spinal cord. And then that's then relayed back into the bicep, which causes the muscle to withdraw. So that's a kind of nociceptive reflex arc. There's also signals transmitted to the brain where pain is felt, but the withdrawal of the arm does not require the pain that's felt in the brain. In fact, it happens frequently before any pain is felt. And so again, what this means is that just because animals withdraw from or avoid injury, it could simply be these nociceptive reflexes. It could not have anything to do with pain. That doesn't show that an animal feels pain. And so challenges like this make it really difficult, I think, to try and assess sentience in non-human animals without the capacity for language. So I guess one of my key messages here is forget certainty. I think that applies not just to invertebrates, to some other vertebrates as well. But we can't conclusively, definitively kind of answer this question scientifically. We can't say this group of animals is definitely sentient. That group of animals definitely isn't. I think we just simply do not have the methods available, at least currently, to do that. But this, I guess, raises a question. It's why I still work in this area, despite being quite a skeptic of it myself, is how do we address the ethical and legal importance of sentience whilst acknowledging scientific uncertainty? If we say, well, that difference between pebble and poodle, the important thing is sentience, then I think we do need to study sentience scientifically, but somehow get across the uncertainty, deal with the uncertainty in that situation. So how can we do that? And an approach which is often kind of cited, which I think is very useful, is the precautionary principle. And this essentially says that in the face of serious potential welfare risks, we should treat animals as if they are sentient, even in the absence of certainty. So even if we don't necessarily know for sure that an animal is sentient, if it's kind of plausible that they are and there are severe potential welfare risks, like those 250 billion crustaceans being slaughtered annually, then we should act as if they are sentient and think about their welfare. Nonetheless, that principle, I think, raises some potentially quite serious issues, which is that, well, what stops us from admitting pebbles into that presumed sentience club? Just surely anything could then be considered as sentient. And so I think we have to say that this kind of precautionary reasoning doesn't mean that anything goes. It doesn't mean we should just assume that everything is sentient. I think we still need some evidence that the animal is plausibly sentient. In other words, I think that we should say that the animal cannot be easily ruled out as a sentience candidate like a pebble would be, but instead that I think it's plausible that the animal is sentient, and therefore potentially we should invoke the precautionary principle. So I guess then the question becomes, are insects and indeed other invertebrates plausibly sentient? And the traditional view on this has been, firstly, not very well discussed, but when it is, usually kind of an emphatic no. And a traditional point that's been made quite a lot is that invertebrates respond purely by these kind of nociceptive reflexes and are almost certainly not sentient. In part, I think that's based on some quite good observations, stuff like insects not responding apparently to quite severe injuries. And that point was made in a paper which is still cited widely, Eisman et al. 1984, which was essentially a mini review of evidence for sentience in insects. And they kind of reflected to some extent this traditional view. They said the evidence from consideration of the adaptive role of pain, the neural organization of insects, and observations of their behavior does not appear to support the occurrence of in insects of a pain state such as occurs in humans. And it is likely that the same could be said of other invertebrates. Now, this paper gets quite a bad rap from some of my colleagues who think that insects are plausibly sentient. I actually think it's to some extent underrated. Some negative points of this paper are that it's based almost entirely on anecdotal type evidence. For example, there's one case where they talk about sort of seeing one ant walking with a limp, but it's not actually sort of peer reviewed or measured in any way. But some benefits are that they're actually considering this question of insect pain, which I think a lot of insect researchers don't. That they were talking in terms of probabilities rather than saying, okay, this is definitely evidence, very strong evidence against pain. I think that's a positive. And I think as well, they also talk about taking a precautionary approach despite coming to this conclusion, which I think as well I could get on board with. But nonetheless, this traditional view is broadly speaking that insect responses are sort of purely reflexive, and therefore they're almost certainly not sentient. I'm personally of the view that that traditional view is now very much open to reinterpretation in the light of more recent evidence. So when the government were drafting the Animals Welfare Sentience Bill, what became the Animal Sentience Act, they asked my colleagues and I to basically review the evidence of sentience in some invertebrates, specifically the cephalopod mollusks, so the octopus, the squid, and the cuttlefish, and the decapod crustaceans, so lobsters, crabs, shrimps and prawns. If you're interested in that report, there's a link to it here. It's very long, fair warning. We also did a journal paper with open commentary to kind of invite a whole range of opinions on our findings, and a shorter magazine article as well. But essentially our approach to assessing evidence for sentience in invertebrates was to come up with certain criteria. We came up with 8 in the end, 8 sort of lines of evidence for sentience. And we were looking at whether the animals satisfied these criteria, and if so, how many. The first was the presence of nociceptors, so these sort of specialized injury detecting cells. Now, as I've said, nociception alone can be entirely without pain, and therefore this is not certainly strong evidence on its own of sentience, but I think nonetheless it's an important prerequisite to think about. The second criterion was about integrative brain regions, particularly integrating different sensory information. In human consciousness research, this seems like a really key thing that consciousness and sentience do, is to integrate different sensory information. So does the animal do that, and if so, how? We looked at connections from the nociceptors to these integrative brain regions, whether the animal's behavioral responses were affected by potential, for example, anesthetics or analgesics in ways consistent with the experience of pain, distress, and suffering in particular. We looked at motivational trade-offs, which I'll discuss in more detail later, but the idea behind these is that if an animal's simply responding by a nociceptive reflex, then it won't trade off different motivations in that response. I think that's somewhat controversial, but I'll discuss that more later in the presentation. Does the animal exhibit flexible self-protective behaviors if it's injured? Associative learning, and in particular types of associative learning which are linked to consciousness in humans. And then finally, whether the animal will value anesthetics or analgesics when injured. So these are our kind of broad 8 lines of evidence that potentially an animal cannot be easily ruled out of that sentience club. You can see the first 4 relate to the nervous system, and the latter 4 relate to the animal's behavioral responses. I want to make a note on our criteria at this point, which is that they are not about certainty. They're about plausibility. Often, I think that that they're taken to say that, say, if an animal, for example, satisfies all 8, then it's definitely sentient, or even this is some sort of definition of sentience. That's not the case. They're simply about saying, is the animal likely enough to be sentient that we should start to think about precautionary reasoning and start to think about their welfare? So our criteria ask this question: is there enough evidence of sentience for us to take a precautionary approach to that animal's welfare? I'm not going to go into too much detail on the report, primarily because it wasn't on insects, it was on decapods and cephalopods. But I think this is a nice study illustrating the kinds of evidence that we can get in invertebrates. It was essentially a condition place avoidance and preference study on octopuses. So in this study, octopuses had 2 chambers. There's a stripy one and a spotty one in this diagram. And they had an initial preference for one of the 2 chambers. So in this diagram, they have an initial preference for the stripy chamber. Now, in these 2 treatments that you can see here, in the neutral stimulus treatment, they were injected in one of their tentacles with a control saline solution in that initially preferred chamber, whereas in the noxious stimulus treatment, they were injected with acetic acid in that initially preferred chamber. And what Robin Crook, who ran this experiment, found was that if they were injected with the control in that preferred chamber, they didn't change their preference. But if they were injected with that noxious stimulus, they would change their preference. So they showed this kind of conditioned place avoidance behavior. They were conditioned to avoid a place where they'd received a noxious stimulus. Then I think even more excitingly than this, in a treatment with analgesia, so lidocaine, where they were injected with the acid in both chambers, if they were injected with an analgesic, with lidocaine in the non-preferred chamber, they would develop a kind of preference for that chamber. So they're responding to analgesics in a way that's at least consistent, I think, with an experience of pain. They're learning to associate one of the chambers with an analgesic solely when they're injured. This didn't happen in the control if they were given a sort of control saline injection in both chambers. And if they were given that acetic acid injection in both chambers, but lidocaine in the non-preferred one, they learned to prefer that chamber. So this kind of condition-place preference effect using an analgesic. There are also some other observations which I think are less convincing, but that the animals seem to pay attention to the arm that they were injected in, but only in that noxious stimulus treatment. And there was also evidence of extreme nerve activity in the brachial connective, which connects the tentacles to the brain, but again, only in that noxious stimulus treatment. So I think if we think in terms of our 8 criteria, this study actually satisfies several on its own. Neural connections between the nociceptors and the integrated brain regions, responses, this is, I guess, the crucial one, to an analgesic, potentially flexible self-protective behavior, although I think that's less clear-cut, associative learning in the form of condition-place preference and condition-place avoidance, and then valuing that analgesic in a way that's, I think, very consistent with a pain experience in octopus. So a really compelling study, I think, on its own. We basically took lots of similar studies to this and then constructed these tables evaluating the evidence overall. So what this table shows along the top is the 8 criteria, and then down the side, the different groups of cephalopods. So you have the octopuses, the cuttlefish, the squid, and then the nautiluses. And then we evaluated whether we had from low and very low confidence to high or very high confidence that group of animals satisfied that criterion. So for this top row here, the octopuses, we had either high or very high confidence that they satisfied 7 of the 8 criteria, which I think is probably the strongest evidence for sentience in any invertebrate group, certainly that we've looked at. I think potentially quite compelling evidence in octopuses that they're showing at least behavior that's highly consistent with the idea that they might be sentient. I think it's very difficult to definitively rule out sentience in, for example, octopuses. In terms of decapods, this is what the picture looks like. You've got the different groups of decapods down the side. Mercifully, I'm not going to go into too much detail on decapods, although they're wonderful and I love them. But sadly, I was asked to talk about insects. But I will make a couple of points. Firstly, the group of decapods that did the best, at least according to our framework, was the true crabs. They satisfied kind of 5 of the criteria. But perhaps more importantly, groups down here like the Penaeid shrimps did really very poorly. They only satisfied 1 of our criteria. And you might take from that a kind of conclusion that, well, the evidence for sentience, or the evidence is against sentience in Penaeid shrimps, that there's really strong evidence against sentience. But I think that would be the wrong interpretation of this kind of table. Instead, where we have kind of very low or low confidence that they satisfy these criteria, research simply hasn't been done in these areas. And so it'd be wrong to say that this shows definitively that Penaeid shrimps are not sentient, because their research simply hasn't been done. In other words, absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. And I guess this raises the question of how we should deal with understudied groups. This is quite a controversial question, but in our report, we argued that rather than just protecting only the well-studied species, it's better to aim for broad coverage in high-level legislation. So to generalize from species that have been very well-studied to ones that haven't been as well-studied, but that we should back this up with best practice guidance specific to the needs of commercially or scientifically important species. So animals like common octopuses, common cuttlefish, shore crabs, and hermit crabs, which have been quite well-studied, we should develop tailored best practice guidance, but we shouldn't only protect these animals. I don't think an animal's welfare protection status should be determined by how often they're studied. And indeed, this is a very common principle in vertebrates, for example. So to my knowledge, beavers, say, have never been studied in terms of sentience, but we generalize evidence from, say, rats and mice to beavers, so that we, broadly speaking, usually would include beavers in our animal welfare legislation. And so based on this kind of principle of generalization, the recommendation from our report, well, the central recommendation was that all cephalopods and all decapods should be regarded as sentient animals for the purposes of animal welfare law. That received some resistance in the Houses of Parliament. This is a quote in the parliamentary record from Lord Moylan. He asked, who are the scientists in whom the government are placing such faith for the scientific basis of animal sentience that they claim to exist? Where do they gather? Which respectable journals do they publish in? Who is this cadre of leading animal sentience scientists? I'm told that in House of Lords speak, this officially counts as a diss. But fortunately, most MPs and most peers did not agree with Lord Moylan. And in fact, the outcome of our report was that an amendment was made to the bill, adding cephalopod mollusks and decapod crustaceans to the Animal Sentience Act. This received a lot of media coverage, which I suppose in one sense was a positive. It broadly speaking was quite supportive of the idea of some welfare protections for decapods and cephalopods. But I do think to some extent that it was a job very much half done. Because one big group of animals, which I think we did not look at initially, was insects. And there was a very good reason for that, which was really that the government were not interested in our views on sentience in insects. They asked us to evaluate the evidence in cephalopods and decapods. But still, because we thought this was a job half done, we subsequently applied our criteria to insects, and we wrote a long review paper. This was led by Matilda Gibbons, who was then a PhD student, but is now a postdoc at UPenn, others like Megan Barrett and so on. And we produced this review where we basically applied our framework to insects to see, okay, well, how will insects do if we actually assess them using the same criteria? Is there evidence for sentience in insects? And if so, how strong might that be? I'm going to give a few examples of studies. This first one I was involved in, it was again led by Matilda Gibbons, but it was looking at motivational trade-offs. So this idea that if an animal is responding solely by a kind of nociceptive reflex, then it won't trade off competing motivations. Georgia, by the way, I should say before this presentation, told me she was very skeptical of motivational trade-offs as evidence for sentience. I'm also quite skeptical, but I'll get to that skeptical point after I've explained this study. So this is an image of the setup that we had in the lab for this study. There's a kind of nest box there where the colony of bees were kept, and then bees could go out into the kind of feeding arena, which had 4 feeders. 2 were pink and the other 2 were yellow. You can see here a close-up of the pink feeder. The animal basically drinks sugar, where you can see that that cartoon bee, and to do so it would have to stand on a heat pad. So the 2 motivations here were firstly to avoid 50-degree heat. So if we turned on the heat pads and blasted out 50-degree heat, they didn't like that. And so that was motivation 1, to avoid 50-degree heat. But the kind of competing motivation number 2, was to consume high concentration sugar solution. So we could give the different colors of feeders different concentrations of sugar solution. So the yellow feeders had 40% sugar solution, so a very high percentage of sugar solution, but coupled with that 50-degree heat. So the animals kind of had to walk on that high heat in order to get that really good sugar. The pink feeders, however, depending on the bee, could have different concentrations of sugar solution. So 10% or 20% very low concentrations, or 30 and 40% sugar. But crucially, it didn't have any heat. So the bees were choosing between the yellow feeders, high concentration of sugar, versus the pink feeders, which had, in many cases, lower concentrations of sugar, but no heat to worry about. And for the animals, for the bees that got like 10 or 20% sugar concentration at those pink feeders, there was a really big difference between the yellow feeders and the pink. Whereas for the bees that say had 40% at all the feeders, that difference did not exist. Now you can see in the results that the bees did trade off those motivations. So here along the x-axis, we have the sugar concentration at the pink feeders, 10%, so a big difference to the yellow, 20%, 30%, 40%, where they were the same at the yellow and the pink. I should say, by the way, that we counterbalanced which feeders had the heat pads and the high concentrations, but for the sake of simplicity, let's keep it as the same colors. Up the y-axis, we then have the proportion of feeds at the yellow feeders, so from 0 to 1. And you can see that broadly speaking, there's this trend that as the sugar concentration at the pink feeders increases, the proportion of feeds at the yellow feeders decreases. And that when we turned on the heat pads, so when they had that sort of noxious 50-degree heat, that increased the effect. So the animals are trading off this motivation to consume high concentration sugar against the motivation to avoid 50-degree heat. And again, I think this satisfies, in some respects, several of our criteria. Suggests that integrating information from different sensory sources, motivational trade-offs, fairly obviously, and also associative learning. And that associative learning thing is crucial. And it's crucial for this reason, that one of the reasons I imagine that Georgia is skeptical of motivational trade-offs being evidence for sentience, certainly a reason that I'm skeptical of it, is that there's evidence for them in C. elegans, this incredibly simple nematode worm. So in this study, Gosh et al. 2016, C. elegans were put at this start point, and then they basically had to cross an arena in order to go to a food odor. And to do so, they had to cross a hyperosmotic barrier, so risk the threat of desiccation. And crucially, what Gosh et al. Found was that C. elegans were more inclined to cross this hyperosmotic barrier if they were food deprived than if they weren't. So I guess in motivational trade-off parlance, we might say that C. elegans tolerates threat, the threat of desiccation, that's the first motivation, more when it's hungry, and that's the second motivation. And really kind of worryingly for anyone who thinks this is good evidence for sentience, this motivational trade-off is mediated by a single interneuron. So really simple neural mechanism explaining this kind of motivational trade-off. So what does this mean for motivational trade-offs as evidence for sentience? Well, I think it means that these kind of very simple ones probably aren't very good evidence for sentience. But in our study, I think we went beyond those very simple motivational trade-offs because in our study, it wasn't just direct sensory inputs that the animals were trading off. So it wasn't that they were tasting the sugar, feeling the heat, and then based on that, they were making their decision. Instead, they actually had to make the decision before they landed at the feeders. So it was in a kind of associative memory, what we might call a mental representation of the two values that was leading to the trade-off. I think that's certainly more complicated. I don't think it's a definitive demonstration of pain in bees, but I think it's more likely to be so than those very simple motivational trade-offs. And I think it's certainly unlikely that it can be mediated by a single interneuron. Something which I will say, by the way, at this point is that I really do think that a key future avenue for animal research on sentience in insects and other animals is to back translate the sort of measure that we're using, like motivational trade-offs, back to humans, and to look at the extent to which humans require consciousness, humans require sentience in order to do the kind of task that we're setting animals. And so I would love to see that a kind of example of this kind of learnt motivational trade-off back translated to humans to see whether there's any better evidence that it's linked to sentience. But for now, I certainly think it's stronger evidence than the more simple motivational trade-offs that have been done before. Here's another study which I was not involved in on analgesic self-administration in bees. In this study, injured and uninjured honeybees were given feeders which contained either analgesic, so it was morphine that was provided, or no morphine, so just control kind of sucrose feeders. So the question was, well, do injured honeybees go to those morphine feeders more than uninjured honeybees? You can see the results here. So we have the relative consumption from the feeders up along the y-axis, and then along the x, you have the two morphine treatments, so either the kind of control or the injured individuals, and then the two sucrose feeder treatments, so again, either the control or the injured individuals. The key point here is that there was really no difference between the control and the injured individuals in their consumption of morphine. So the authors of this study kind of concluded that, well, potentially actually insects are not able to self-administer an analgesic when they're injured. So potentially insects fail this criterion. And I bring up this study in part because it was one of the few examples where we had kind of evidence against one of our criteria in insects. And in that sense, it's perhaps been quite influential. However, I'm not wholly convinced by this interpretation, and I'm not convinced for this reason, that to self-administer analgesics, an injured animal must know two things. The first of those things is that the behavioral response necessary to administer the drug. So what do I have to do in order to get the drug? And the second thing is the drug's analgesic effect. So the kind of Greening et al. Interpretation of their findings was that the bees did not know the drug's analgesic effect. But I think that we can reasonably say that potentially it was number one that they didn't know, the behavioral response, because the morphine and control feeders were presented simultaneously. That is, they were both there at the same time. And so if morphine's analgesic effects aren't immediate, and the bees weren't using the morphine feeder when the effect kicked in, I think we can reasonably ask, well, would the bees have learned to associate the drug's effect with the morphine feeder? And in fact, in the sort of mammal literature, they get around this by presenting the analgesic and the control feeders successively. So the animal might have, say, 2 or 3 hours with only the morphine feeder, 2 or 3 hours with only the control feeder, and then a kind of dual presentation. But this study didn't do that. And so I think it sort of emphasizes the importance of sound experimental design. Also, insects don't have opioid receptors, so morphine was an interesting choice of analgesic. But anyway, so I don't think that was necessarily particularly strong evidence against sentience in insects. This is a summary table of a few of the groups of insects that we looked at in our review. Again, a kind of mixed evidential picture. Flies at the top satisfying kind of 5 or 6 criteria, which is notable in that it was a similar number to the true crabs, which led to protection in the UK under the Animal Sentience Act. Bees, wasps and ants, so the hymenopterans, fewer, maybe 4 or 5. And lepidopterans, so butterflies and moths, fewer still, kind of maybe 3. But again, I think the important point to emphasize here is that where we've got lots of these kind of very low confidences, it's not that the animals have been kind of rigorously tested and they simply can't satisfy these criteria. It's more that the research has not been done. So no one's actually looked. And that honeybee self-administration study is one of the few exceptions. But as I say, I don't think it's particularly strong evidence against. Most of these kind of empty boxes, most of these very low confidence boxes are very low because the research has not been done. So I do think that, again, a key takeaway of what I'm saying here is that it'd be great if more people were working on sentience in insects so that we can start to build up a clearer evidential picture. I will now make another note on our criteria, which is that they were designed to evaluate invertebrates that have really never been studied in the context of sentience. So we really wanted criteria that could focus on aspects of biology that may have been studied in other contexts. Hence why we looked at things like nociception and learning, because we wanted to be able to evaluate groups like the Penaeid shrimps to some extent, which simply hadn't been studied in this context of sentience. Now, I think in a sense that kind of undersells the insects, because our criteria do not encompass all possible evidence for sentience. That's a crucial point. They don't cover every possible line of evidence that you might have. And so this undersells the case for insects because they have been studied in the context of sentience. And so there's some, I think, quite remarkable results on sentience and consciousness in insects, which we didn't include in our criteria because it would have biased them against groups of invertebrates that hadn't been very well studied, but which nonetheless deserve some consideration. So one example of that is cognitive or judgment bias. This is based on the observation that people in relatively positive emotional states tend to interpret ambiguous stimuli more optimistically than people in relatively negative emotional states. So, for example, if you give clinically depressed people pictures of kind of blank faces, neutral faces, then they'll tend to say that they look more kind of sad or depressed or anxious than healthy populations of people. And I've always found this remarkable ever since I got into animal welfare science, but some other animals at least seem to do the same thing. So a famous example was this study on rats, Harding et al. 2004, which suggested that rats in more negative kind of welfare states would interpret ambiguous stimuli less optimistically. And so this has been taken as a kind of indicator of emotion in animals, in no small part because it's linked to felt emotion in humans. And I bring this up in the context of insects because some years after this initial Harding et al. Study on animals, Melissa Bateson and colleagues showed that bees also seem to exhibit a form of this kind of judgment bias effect. And so this is the training regime that bees were trained on a kind of CS plus odor to extend their proboscis in order to receive a kind of sucrose reward. but not to extend their proboscis in order to avoid a kind of quinine punishment. So they were trained on this kind of known odor, which was a blend of two odors, to extend their proboscis in order to get a reward, but not on this CS minus, this other odor blend, in order to avoid a punishment. Then the kind of manipulation of, in inverted commas, the bee's emotional state was that half were stressed out by being shaken for 60 seconds, which bees really do not like, and the other half were kind of controlled, so they were undisturbed. And then the test odors were these three novel odors, which were kind of intermediate blends of the CS plus and the CS minus. So these were odors that the bees hadn't come across before. And the sort of hypothesis here was that if bees are being more optimistic, then they'll be more likely to these ambiguous blends to extend their proboscis, to expect the CS plus outcome, to be expecting a positive outcome in the face of ambiguity, this kind of functional definition of optimism. And indeed, that's precisely what this study found, at least for the odor blend closest to the CS minus. You can see that the control bees were more likely to exhibit that proboscis extension response, that CS plus response, than the shaken bees. So the shaken bees were, at least according to this behavioral measure, less inclined to expect a positive outcome from an ambiguous stimulus. So this kind of result, this judgment bias result, was not included in our criteria, in our framework, simply because judgment bias hasn't been studied in any invertebrates outside of insects. But we might say that there should be kind of a bonus criterion for insects of judgment bias. And I think there are other cases for that as well, where there are really exciting results in insects showing really quite remarkable things, which were not included in our criteria, but which nonetheless, I think are potentially at least consistent with sentient and possibly quite good evidence for it. So which animals could be sentient? Well, this is kind of the legal view in the UK now, vertebrates, decapods, and cephalopods. But I think we can add in the insects as kind of potential candidates, that they plausibly could be sentient. I certainly think that we can't easily rule out the possibility of insect sentience. With the caveat, however, that in all these cases, we cannot be certain. We can't say they are or are not. We can only talk, I think, in terms of probability raising and reducing criteria. So two conclusions, I guess, from this presentation. First, that in my view, we cannot conclusively rule out sentience in insects. That traditional view, I think, is wrong. And that at least some insects are plausibly sentient. It's not to say they are sentient, but I think it's plausible to think that they may be. And the, I guess, more controversial takeaway from that is that based on kind of precautionary reasoning, this means that we should at least consider insect welfare. We should at least be thinking about it. And shameless plug here, we recently published a paper aimed at researchers saying that people who study insects should at least be thinking about their subjects' welfare. That's not to say that we shouldn't do research on insects, we shouldn't do invasive research on insects. It's simply that we should take a somewhat precautionary approach to actually thinking about our subjects' welfare. I'm not going to talk in any more detail about insect welfare because I think Megan Barrett is talking about that next month and she's much better qualified to do so than I am. I will, though, finish on a message of why I think insect welfare really matters given this plausibility of sentience, which is to go back to this graph on the number of invertebrates being killed. This is the number of crustaceans, that massive 250 billion figure, more than the sum total of all mammal and bird livestock in the world. But it gets even scarier if we start to add insects onto this kind of graph, because if we add the number of, say, insects farmed for protein onto this graph, it dwarfs even the number of crustaceans. 1.2 trillion insects were estimated to be farmed for protein for human food and animal feed every year. And that actually was an estimate from a few years ago now, and the industry is rapidly expanding. So it could well be higher. So we're talking about substantially more insects being farmed every year than all mammal and bird livestock. And this isn't even the scariest graph, because the scariest graph is if we add on the number of insects that are killed by pesticides every year, which has been estimated at 1 quadrillion individuals. I think that's a 1 with like 15 zeros. So it turns all of those other bars into just lines at the bottom. So potentially huge numbers of individuals that are being killed in ways that I don't think would be compatible with calling them a humane endpoint. And since virtually no animal welfare scientists in the world are working on, say, developing faster acting, more humane pesticides, I'm going to come back to this presentation's big idea that animal welfare science is fundamentally misguided. And this is why I think that, because if our aim is to minimize animal suffering, then we should all be thinking about insects. I think insects really should be the next frontier for animal welfare science. And sadly, very few welfare scientists are currently thinking about them. So with that, I'd like to thank you very much for listening, and I'd be very happy to take questions.
Andrew, we were muted, so you couldn't hear us clapping, but we were clapping.
It's okay. I imagined rapturous standing ovation level applause.
There was rapture, such people were whooping, hats were thrown. So yeah, brilliant talk, Andrew. And I'm looking to see if there's any questions online. So far, people are quiet, so I'm going to ask people in the room if they've got any questions. I've got about 25, but Joey.
I have so many questions.
Yes.
I just want to echo George's point. This was an excellent talk. I'm a aquatic community ecologist. I rarely think about these things, and yet I found it fascinating, so thank you. So I have two questions at least top of mind. One is maybe I'll start with this first thing. This associative learning component. One of your criteria was associative, or the evidence of associative learning. We have, I think when I think about bacteria, for example, I guess what is the criteria? I don't actually know the definition of that, but my understanding is like bacteria, for example, they might have an internal model. They obviously don't have a brain they wouldn't satisfy your criteria there, but internal models, for example, encoded in their metabolic networks within their cells that can sort of internalize the correlation between, for example, oxygen and temperature, and in some ways anticipate changes in oxygen based on a change in temperature and that kind of thing. So to me, that would be an example of associative learning. There's also like multi-generational patterns in which, over time, descendants of ancestors that were exposed to these correlations can somehow internalize those correlations and change their behavior in some way. So I guess I just wonder, do you agree that associative learning is something that's not just restricted to animals, and what actually are my question is, what are the criteria for how, tell me more about associative learning, and does it exist in bacteria from your perspective?
Yeah, fantastic question. Thank you. This is something that I could have happily done the whole presentation on, is that one criterion. So instead, I didn't really mention it. So first point, you're absolutely right that there are, I think, pretty clear-cut cases where associative learning can happen in complete absence of sentience. So the human spinal cord, for example, coma patients, decerebrate rats, lots of other examples of kind of simple classical conditioning occurring without any need for sentience. Initially, our kind of framework did not take that into account, and it wasn't because we rejected that. It was more because we were concerned about this issue of simply animals not having been studied in the right ways. But when we sort of published it with kind of open commentary, a lot of people made precisely this point and said, no, you need to tighten up that criterion. So subsequently, we have done that. And so now we focus on specifically forms of learning which are associated with consciousness in humans. Now, that's a very controversial research area. I think Georgia has some viewpoints on this, so maybe she wants to come in after I've spoken. But there are some empirical studies on humans suggesting that certain forms of learning are linked to consciousness. So there's been recent work suggesting that operant conditioning might require consciousness in humans, although that's very controversial. There's been much discussed stuff on trace conditioning, which is associative learning with a kind of time delay between the US and the CS. Multimodal learning, there's some experimental evidence suggesting that might be linked to consciousness. And so I think those forms of learning are potentially evidence for sentience in animals, but really I think we need the sort of human consciousness researchers to tighten up that link between learning and consciousness much, much better than what it is now. So that's the kind of short form answer of what kinds of forms of learning we're looking at. Georgia, do you want to come in there? Because I know you have lots of thoughts on this.
I mean, I guess I'd just agree with you, really. I mean, I think what's nice about, say, Ava Jablonka's arguments is not that they're convincing on their own, but they provide a research agenda for working on humans. So if you look at human consciousness research, there's hardly anything on conscious emotion and conscious moods. Human consciousness researchers look at explicit understanding of grammar rules and visual consciousness almost entirely. And so they need to be persuaded that doing some quite basic research on, do you need to be able to detect a reward to learn a task to get it? That would be massively useful for animal researchers, and they just haven't done it yet. But I think they could be persuaded, especially because there's now money from groups like Open Philanthropy who are really interested in solving these problems because they've got such ethical weight. Yeah, so I'm basically unconvinced by Pavlovian conditioning, but I think operant conditioning has got quite a lot of potential, at least because it's not been ruled out as yet.
Yeah. Okay. I have one other quick question.
Go for it.
Okay, so I am also, I study responses to climate change and warming, and it strikes me when you show that insect graph, like all those pesticides, but of course, like heat waves every year and climate change in general is a major threat to insects. Massive die-offs. I mean, we see, you know, so I wonder, given, this is more of a legal question, but obviously, like, we have trouble mobilizing any action against climate change just generally. But can this sort of legal argument, what are the, does classifying something as sentient also maybe somehow give us like legal teeth in some way that could be used as a way of, you know, managing climate change in some way? Does that, I mean, I guess I just wonder, what are the legal, okay, if I refine my question, what does classifying an animal as sentient do in terms of protection, conservation status, and that kind of thing? Does it do anything at all?
Yeah, no, again, fantastic question. There's probably a few questions to unpack there. I suppose the first question is, to what extent do we have ethical obligations to wild animals that might be impacted by human activity like climate change? I would say that yes, we do have those kind of obligations, but I don't think that's unique to invertebrates. I think that's also the case for mammals and birds and so on. And it seems to make vanishingly little difference to people and how they behave and how lawmakers behave. Kind of any sort of arguments to do with how it might impact biodiversity. It seems to make vanishingly little difference saying you and your children may kind of like be incinerated in 40 years. So, you know, saying it's going to negatively affect invertebrate populations, I don't think will really add anything to that. And then I suppose there's the question of what should we be focusing on when we talk about invertebrate welfare issues. I'm personally of the view, although others are welcome to disagree, that we shouldn't be focusing on things like wild insects under climate change, which would be controversial even for mammals. That we should be focusing on things where I think we can actually potentially make a real difference. So insect farming is this kind of burgeoning industry, but that's still relatively small compared to where it's likely to be in a few years' time. I think pesticide use as well is one where relatively small changes in this industry that could be economically beneficial might have huge impacts on animal welfare. So those are kind of my personal focuses, but you know, that's just my personal focus.
Yeah.
Okay,
cool.
thank you.
Brilliant. And there's a couple of really great questions online. It took me a while to read them because the font is tiny. But here's a question from Catherine Drotus, who says, amazing talk. Her question is, to what extent do you think sort of human proximity assumptions, and I think she means here sort of analogy, are still playing into the research? For example, is it right to assume that C. elegans can't be sentient because what it's doing is reliant on a single interneuron? Is that unfair or is it fair? And is it fair to say that an animal like a bee doesn't like something? So you said the bees don't like being shaken. Well, Andrew, are you just being really anthropomorphic?
Again, a couple of things to get into there. Am I being really anthropomorphic? I don't think so, no. Frans de Waal has this useful term which he introduced of anthropo-denial, which is to say that by avoiding anthropomorphism, at some point you must go too far in not attributing human-like states to animals when they're actually warranted. So when it comes to shaking for bees, we know they have a very strong preference, for example, to avoid that kind of situation. So if I'm saying they don't like, I suppose there are kind of undertones of sentience in there, which I probably shouldn't use. But I think if I were to say they have a preference against that, it's poor for their welfare, that would be entirely fair. That was the second half. The first half, remind me again, Georgia, what was the first half of the question?
Well, C. elegans, like he.
Oh yes,
I mean,
C. elegans.
I agree with you. You dismissed it because it's doing all of this based on a single interneuron. I think it's just like my Prius in terms of its use of sentience in trade-offs. But it maybe unpack why you think something reliant on a single interneuron can't be sentient.
Yes, and I think the question was also about, is there still a kind of mechanistic kind of similarity to humans issue? Why do I think a single neuron can't be sentient? It's kind of a big question. So in human consciousness science, there's a lot of debate about what kind of comes within the zone of reasonable disagreement for a theory of consciousness. So a lot of theories, the kind of usual ones, would tend to focus on kind of the way that the human brain works, particularly the healthy adult human brain. And from that to say, okay, we're going to take our theory of consciousness from that. There are other theories of consciousness, though, which, and those theories would certainly rule out any sort of consciousness in a single neuron. There are other theories of consciousness, though, that are much more controversial, which might not rule out consciousness in a single neuron. And so there's currently big debate in the human field about whether we can actually say that. I will put it this way, that I think those theories that wouldn't rule out consciousness in a single neuron must accept that consciousness is fundamentally different in the way that we have it, in the form of a whole brain made up of, 70 billion neurons, than the sort of very basal level of consciousness in the single neuron. Consciousness, at least in humans, is very much the product of relationships between, in our case, vast numbers of neurons. I didn't necessarily mean to suggest that in C. elegans, simply because it's in C. elegans, that it definitely can't be sentient, although I would be inclined to think that C. elegans probably isn't. I think it was more the case that it's such a simple neural mechanism. It's a neural mechanism that we humans have vast numbers of, and there's no real question of us thinking that they're sentient. And so the idea that it can be done so simply, to me, suggests that those kind of forms of motivational trade-offs are not particularly good evidence for sentience. C. elegans, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily go either way on it, although some people have speculated based on our criteria that actually it satisfies kind of maybe 3 or 4 quite successfully. And then the final part of that question, which I think was, to what extent is bias on the differences from humans still affecting this kind of area? Absolutely. And in some ways that's justified. So I think we can reasonably say that across vertebrates, there's a kind of basically conserved brain, sort of forebrain, midbrain, hindbrain structure. And so if there is anything important about that particular structure, and in mammals, it might be kind of, say, the cortex or the avium pallium, if that structure for some reason is important, then insects are not going to be sentient. But if, however, sentience can arise by more than one different type of brain, then I think it's not unlikely that insects are sentient. So things like maybe a mushroom body in an insect, or a central complex, although it's not really got a direct homologue in humans or in other mammals, might perform an analogous function. So I think that's absolutely right, that is a commonly cited reason why insects aren't seen as sentient as frequently.
Right, brilliant. And there's another question here from Hannah Brazo, who says she works with captive bumblebees and has been seeing quite a bit of behaviour that seems play-like. So it's a bit like the ball rolling behaviour found by Lars Chitka and obviously Hamida Merwan as well. So what are your thoughts on the use of behaviour that's not motivated by food, pain, etc., in determining whether or not an insect is sentient? So other candidates.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think Hamida was more circumspect than Lars in the interpretation of that behaviour. I don't recall her ever suggesting it might be an indicator of sentience in a way that Samadhi Galpagi, who led that study, and Lars Chitka, whose lab it was in, did. It's difficult for me to comment too much on it because the argument wasn't really made when they suggest that. It was kind of a sort of throwaway line towards the end of the paper, and I've never quite drilled down into why they think. My understanding is that it's something to do with the fact that if play is sort of self-rewarding behavior, then potentially sort of positive mental states are the kind of rewarding thing. In that case, I don't think there's anything special about play. I think potentially other kind of self-rewarding behaviors might equally come into this category. And I don't necessarily see them as evidence for sentience. But I guess it would probably be Samadhi or Lars who one would have to ask whether that's what the argument is there rather than me, because I'm not entirely sure I follow it. Out of interest, what kind of play behavior have you been seeing in the bumblebees?
Hannah, if they're type away or turn your camera on and mime.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay. So the play behavior I've been seeing is they form a ball out of spent flowers and roll them, but they also kind of rake up spent flowers, fly to the top of the cage, and dive into them like a dog jumping into a pile of raked up leaves.
Wow.
That's very interesting. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, it would be cool to see videos. That is very interesting. Any questions in the room? This is probably an easy one for you, Andrew, but you talked about sentience as though it's all or none, but I wondered if you actually think it's either present or absence, or do you think it's graded, so there might be degrees of sentience?
Yeah, this is a really classic question. I actually don't have a strong answer to this, so the idea is basically that either sentience is kind of like a light switch where you flick it on or off. A species either is sentient or is not. Or it's more like a sort of dimmer switch on a light where kind of some species are more sentient than others. My sort of intuition is that I can't really imagine what the dimmer switch version is, because even on the lowest sort of turn of a dimmer switch, something is still sentient. But I also think that, broadly speaking, sentience in an animal like an insect, I suspect, is probably, if it exists, so different to what my emotional experience is like that if I were an insect, would I even kind of understand that experience as sentience at all? So certainly talking about, say, kind of particular emotional states in insects, I think is the wrong way to go. I think we can talk about kind of positive or negative states potentially, but anything more than that, and I think it's probably just so different to our experience that we couldn't imagine it at all. Thomas Nagel has this sort of very, very famous paper, What is it like to be a bat? And he there is not answering the question of, is a bat conscious? He kind of assumes that it is. Instead, he's saying, well, if it were, bats have this kind of echolocation system. And as a human, you just could never imagine what that might be like. It might be like bats have sort of their echolocation kind of looks to them like human vision does to us. Or it might be something that's just completely different to anything that we've ever come across and completely unimaginable. So to some extent, I think that question of, is there degrees of sentience? I think probably sentience, the further you get away from humans, is probably so different to what I would understand as sentience anyway that it kind of doesn't matter. But I'm not sure that's a particularly good answer.
Well, I think where it might matter is if you're doing a project, like we had Bob Fisher talking to us yesterday about the Rethink Priorities Interspecies Welfare Project, and they're trying to scale different species in terms of their maximum positive or negative experiences. You know, if you're a really happy chicken, is that as powerful as being a really happy human or cow, or is it a lesser experience in the same degree of pain? I have no clue how you answer that. I mean, he was quite open in how challenging, maybe borderline impossible it is, but it did raise the spectrum that maybe our scales of experiences are different.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so I maybe expressed some skepticism to Bob about this particular project as well. And in fairness, like you say, I mean, he's very open about saying, look, we realize this is a really hard question, maybe impossible, but it's better to kind of have an estimate than not bother attempting it. Heather Browning, my former colleague, has written, I think, probably the best stuff on this kind of question. My personal view is that it really doesn't make any adaptive sense to me to imagine that, say, a fly has kind of like its equivalent of kind of extreme pain is just kind of like a human stubbing their toe. I think there's probably a reason why pain is up to such an extreme level that it is, which is that, you know, in that kind of situation where you're facing extreme injury, broadly speaking, it usually makes sense to have this kind of extreme motivational aversion. And so I don't see any particular rationale for why. I mean, who's to say that a fly might not have a far more severe form of pain than we do? I like you say, George, I don't see any way of measuring it. I don't think it makes any sense to me to assume that they just automatically have a kind of lesser degree of suffering. Yeah, I think that's broadly my view on the question.
Okay, brilliant. All right, anything else? It looks like online people are getting quiet. Maybe they're getting hungry. Maybe time for lunch. Olga's got one. Okay.
I'm wondering if all similar talks were kind of assuming that sentience is innate and speaking about gradation of sentient level, can we assume that some negative experience, so something that individual experience in their life would affect the level of sentience? I mean, that it experienced overly stressful situation, maybe his level of his feelings is kind of lowered after some experience, so it's not fully innate.
Could you hear that, Andrew?
Yeah, would you mind repeating just to the microphone?
So the essence, and Olga shout if I get this wrong, is Olga's wondering whether sentience is completely innate or whether there's learned or experiential components. So over the course of an organism's lifetime, could it become more or less sentient based on experience? I've never heard that question before, actually.
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. Thank you, Olga. Really interesting question. I guess the sort of area that I'm thinking to go down, and apologies if I'm talking to a sort of psychology audience, because you'll certainly know more about this than me, but there are sort of views in sort of particularly emotion psychology, kind of constructivist views, whereby the idea is that you have kind of broadly sort of positive or negative states, and then it's only through learning concepts that you actually apply things like, say, anger and jealousy, these kind of very kind of culturally defined emotions to them. And so you kind of carve up this kind of positive negative space, like kind of, so the sort of positive negativeness is like sort of cookie dough, and then you carve it up using cookie cutters into sort of these culturally defined emotions. So that's quite a dominant view in emotion psychology, and in a sense there's a level to which that's very much affecting sentience, and so the idea would be that you kind of hone your capacity to feel these emotions over time. And potentially, to some extent, that's also the case in animals, even if whether or not it's the case in humans. So possibly, yes. That's what I'm going to have to think some more about, though, because, yeah, I haven't come across that question before. Thank you very much.
Brilliant. Cool. Well, on that challenging note, as if it wasn't challenging enough, thanks everyone for your great questions. Thank Andrew. This time we're not muted, for a really fantastic talk. Thanks so much, Andrew.
Thank you very much.